Good morning. I'm not a business person or a politician or an evangelist, so I'm not comfortable walking around and preaching, but I'm a writer, and I tell stories. I've written 11 books, and ranging from politicians to sports figures to sociology. I was not expecting to write a book about Detroit. And it happened in the oddest way. I was in New York City in a bar in 2011 in February, watching the Green Bay Packers play in the Super Bowl. And I have to confess, I'm a Packers fan. I'd written a biography of Vince Lombardi. Lions are my second team. I hate the Bears. Anyway, I was anxiously wondering whether they would win the game, and at halftime, it was sort of odd. I was standing next to an actor named Dan Lauria. My book on Lombardi had been turned into a Broadway play, and we were across the street from the theater, and Dan Lauria, who had been the father in the Wonder Years, played Vince Lombardi in the play. And I'm standing next to him while on the screen at halftime they're showing a little skit with Lauria as Lombardi. It was just sort of surreal. And then I looked up again and I saw a commercial with a freeway sign that said Detroit. And that captured my attention. And then I saw all of these iconic images of this city. The Joe Louis fist downtown, the sculpture of the spirit of Detroit, the great Diego Rivera murals of Detroit industry, and then this black sedan driving up Woodward Avenue, and I noticed that it was Detroit's Eminem in the car. I'm a little too old to be an Eminem guy, but it was a hypnotic beat, and he got out of the car and walked into the glorious Fox Theater and down the aisle. And there was a black gospel choir rising in song, and Eminem turned to the camera and said, "This is the Motor City, and this is what we do." And I choked up. I literally had a tear in my eye just watching that commercial. And my wife would later say very wisely, "Why did you fall for that? They're just selling cars. And Detroit is in trouble." And of course, she was right, but it got me thinking, why did it hit me that way? What was it in this commercial? I didn't want to buy a Chrysler, but there was something about Detroit that struck me very deeply at my core. I was born in Detroit. I lived in a flat on Dexter, about a mile up from the Fisher YMCA. My earliest primordial memories are of this city, of the Boblo boat and Verner's ginger ale, so strong it would go up my nostrils, and of my mother working at Hudson's department store, and my father going to Briggs Stadium and coming home with the telltale sign of mustard on his shirt that he slipped out for a day game. All of these wonderful, of swimming at the Fisher YMCA, taking the bus down there as a 6-year-old. And this is one of the traumatic memories, swimming naked in the cold water of the Fisher Y. But all these memories flooded back to me after that commercial and really struck me about this city. I spent most of my adult life in Washington, D.C., and I went to high school in Madison, Wisconsin, and lived in Austin, Texas. But Detroit was at the core of who I am, and I thought, well, what does this mean, and what can I do about it? I'm a writer, so I'll write. And what did I want to write about? I knew that Detroit was in trouble. It was on its way toward bankruptcy then. There are other financial writers who can do that better than I can, and it wasn't really what I was interested in. What I wanted to do was honor this city and write about what it gave America, which is an enormous amount. I started thinking about how I could capture all that it gave America, and really centered on 4 central threads. The most obvious one being the automobile industry. Detroit is the center of sort of the American sensation of freedom and liberation through the automobile. The second being music, the soundtrack of my generation, Motown, just the wonderful, joyous music of the 60s coming out of this city. The labor movement under Walter Reuther and the United Auto Workers, really at the center of the American labor movement, and the rise of the working class into the middle class came out of Detroit. And civil rights. Detroit was at the center of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, with the largest NAACP chapter in the country, with many great leaders coming out of this city and coming to this city, and again connecting to the United Auto Workers, money coming out of Detroit, really in many ways being the bank for the civil rights movement. I have a sort of a motto that I follow when I'm writing a book. I describe the 4 legs of a table for my work. And the first leg of the table is go there. So as soon as I decided to write about Detroit, I started coming back here. This was 4 years ago. And my wife and I would often stay at the Inn on Ferry Street, because it was a couple of blocks from the Walter Reuther Library and Archive at Wayne State University, which had so many of the documents that I was looking for. Another leg of my table is to get the documents. But I said sort of jokingly that when I first got here, I felt that I could walk across Woodward Avenue and sit down in the middle of the street and read War and Peace and not get hit by a car. It felt that desolate then. And we can talk later about what's changed, but it has been a remarkable transformation in just the period of time that I've been working on this book and then coming back to talk about it. It's incredibly important for me to go there, whatever I'm writing about. When I wrote the book about Vince Lombardi, I had to turn to my wife and say, how would you like to move to Green Bay for the winter? Immortal loving words. But it made all the difference. And coming to Detroit in that same way so many times as I was reporting this book made a huge difference. I settled on a specific period of time, because another one of the ways I try to write, I use the metaphor of setting up an oil rig and digging as deeply as I can. So I wanted to find a moment in time which captured all of those 4 elements that I wanted to write about. And it turned out that this period that proved most illuminating for me began in the fall of 1962 and ended in the spring of 1964. 18 months that could tell you almost everything about what Detroit gave America. In the fall of 1962, the Detroit Auto Show at Cobo Hall introduced the 1963 cars that sold more than ever before. They were also very large cars with more chrome and aluminum on them than any cars before. And Detroit had had a brief flirtation with smaller cars, but then was back into the big car business, not seeing at all what was coming at them from Japan and Germany at that point, sort of an overconfidence about what they were doing. At that same week of the Detroit Auto Show, the first Motortown Review left West Grand Boulevard to take the music of Motown to the country. And it was an extraordinary collection of talent put together by Berry Gordy Jr., the founder of Motown, who had founded this company with an $800 loan from his family. Instrumental in that were his sisters, who get not enough credit for what Motown became. They were the ones who really provided their little brother with the money and the inspiration to do what he did. But in any case, these 2 buses left West Grand Boulevard with probably the best collection of talent ever put together on one bus, with Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, with Martha Reeves and the Vandellas, with Mary Wells, with Little Stevie Wonder, with Marvin Gaye, the Supremes, who were just the opening act and nobody was sure if they were going to make it or not, and the Temptations, who were the backup singers for Mary Wells, all in one place coming out of Detroit. And one of the things that I became fascinated with was why? Why did this happen in Detroit? What were the elements that gave it this creative burst, unlike anywhere else in the world for that period of time? You know, civilizations have these moments of creativity, and Motown was representative of that in Detroit. Some of the reasons for it were historic and more apparent. One being the influx of the great migration of African Americans from the South, bringing the oral history and church music and traditions with them. Another was the simple genius of Berry Gordy and his family in terms of being able to develop a business. But there were some other elements that helped create this that I wasn't aware of until I really started reporting the story. And one of them was the geography of Detroit, this vast expanse with single-family homes, with working class and middle class people who had disposable income, and a great piano company, Grinnell Brothers, which made more pianos than any company in the country, and it was easy to get those pianos into the single-family homes in Detroit. So that every musician that I interviewed for this story talked about the piano in their house, whether it was not a Motown person, but Aretha Franklin and her family, or Smokey Robinson, who had a Grinnell Brothers piano, or the Gordy family. All of them talked about the pianos and how important that was in their development as musicians. The other factor that struck me the most was the role of public school music teachers. Again, every musician that I talked to remembered their high school music teacher, their middle school, grade or junior high then music teacher, even their elementary school music teachers. And one of the most, to me, thrilling moments of all of my research came when I was talking to Martha Reeves. And she remembered her elementary school music teacher, Emily Wagstaff. And then she started talking about her high school music teacher, Harry Begian, an Armenian. And she said that he trained his students in classical music, and that she was chosen, plucked out of the choir when she was in high school to sing an aria with her choir at the Ford Auditorium downtown. And you know, I've interviewed Presidents Obama and Clinton and Muhammad Ali and you know, a lot of world famous figures over the course of my long journalism career, but the most thrilling thing I have on tape is Martha Reeves telling me that story and then breaking into this beautiful soprano aria, singing the opera. So the role of music teachers in Detroit and the role of public schools was instrumental to the creativity of that period. The civil rights movement in Detroit and the role of race in any city is complicated and incredibly important in terms of how cities develop. Detroit had a long history, as many of you know, of difficult racial relations going back at least to World War II and the horrible race riot that broke out in a fight over housing and jobs in Detroit. In the period that I'm writing about, there was a young mayor named Jerome Kavanaugh who had been elected in '61 basically because of the African American vote. There'd been a lot of difficulties in this city in the previous few years with the police interactions with the African American community. And Kavanaugh promised to change that. And he was elected because of that, largely. And he brought into office with him a very progressive police chief named George Edwards, who said that he actually stepped down from the Michigan Supreme Court to take the job, and said he did it because he was committed to trying to improve race relations in the city. And together they started making changes in the police force. They became supporters of civil rights. The great moment in the middle of my book came when Martin Luther King arrived in Detroit on June 23rd, 1963. It was during the heat of the civil rights summer. A few months earlier, down in Birmingham, Alabama, King and his followers had been attacked by police dogs and hoses. He arrived in Detroit in June, invited up here to speak and lead a rally. And he was met at the airport by the police chief who said, "You'll find no police dogs here." Detroit was an enlightened city. King was invited to Detroit by the most colorful preacher in the city, Aretha Franklin's father, Reverend C.L. Franklin, who for the 10 years before that had been sort of a roaming, flying preacher going to cities in the South and delivering these sermons to 10,000 people. He was like a rock star, and people knew his sermons by heart, and they'd call out for him to deliver a certain sermon as though it was a hit song. You know, "The eagle stirreth his nest, we want to hear it," and he'd deliver it. He was somewhat controversial in Detroit. He was not particularly beloved by the traditional Baptist ministers in the town, but he wanted to be involved in civil rights, and he brought King to the city, and it turned into this amazing moment. Nobody knew it would happen, but it was a peaceful march, more than 100,000 people walking down Woodward Avenue to Cobo Hall, where King delivered the first major public iteration of the most famous speech in American 20th century history, "I Have a Dream." He dreamed his dream in Detroit first, 2 months before he did it in Washington, D.C. That was Detroit at that moment. The car industry was also being innovative. In secret over in Dearborn, Lee Iacocca and his team were devising the great sexy car of the 1960s, the Mustang. In part of my motto of finding the archives, I went down to Duke University, where all of the papers of the J. Walter Thompson Company are. And there they had the inside story on the selling of the Mustang, the greatest marketing campaign in American history, automotive history. Interestingly enough, the first iteration of the Mustang, it was going to be called the Torino, I found in these papers. Of course, another car was later called that. But they decided not to name it after an Italian city because the colorful president of the Ford Motor Company there, in a way as colorful as Reverend Franklin, was Henry Ford II, the Deuce. And at that moment, he was having an affair with an Italian countess, so they thought it might not be too smart to have a car named after an Italian. But when they were developing the first campaign, it was going to be called the Torino, and the motto was going to be imported from Detroit, the same thing that Chrysler used a half century later. The Mustang was unveiled in April of 1964 at the World's Fair in New York City. And it was the moment of the spring of '64 was kind of a wistful time. It was a moment of great promise. All of the characters in my book, you know, in all of those many different ways, in civil rights, in labor, in music, and in the car industry, did not know what was coming at them in so many different directions in that moment. And Detroit had this long history of connection to the centers of power in the country. In a month after the Mustang was unveiled, Lyndon Johnson arrived in Detroit and landed at Metropolitan Airport and declared Detroit was the engine of America and the center of hope in this country. 4 years earlier, John F. Kennedy had come to Detroit and opened his presidential campaign in Detroit in Cadillac Square, where he delivered the first iteration of the most famous line of his career, "Ask not what your country can do for you." It was a little bit different. He didn't start it with the "ask not," but it was the same exact phrase turned around. Interesting, in Detroit, probably the two most famous political or sociological speeches of America happened in Detroit first, from Kennedy and King. Johnson arrived in Detroit and then flew over to Ann Arbor and delivered the Great Society Address. All of the hope of that moment was captured in what he was talking about, the hope for cities like Detroit. He also saw the problems of the urban dilemma at that moment. But we know what happened after that, and we know what's happening now. I often say that the most important word in the title of my book is "in." Once in a great city. It's not once a great city. It still is a great city. Thank you very much.